Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Swann Galleries. My name is Nicholas Lowry. I'm the president of the auction house, and I'm delighted to say I'm also friends and colleagues with Daniel Wechsler and George Koppelman, the two people we're here today to hear from and question and speak to and perhaps worship. We all live our lives with these stories in the back of our minds about going to a flea market and finding an old picture and deciding the picture is ugly but the frame is nice, so we take the picture out and we find a copy of the Declaration of Independence. And I would expect there's not a single person in this room who hasn't had that thought 3 or 4 times at every flea market or yard sale. It never happens, except when it happens. And it happened, and it's such a great example of wonderful things happening to nice people. I've known Dan and George for many, many years. Not well enough that they let me in on their secret, but well enough that I can share in their excitement and their enthusiasm, and we are delighted that they would come tonight. If you've seen their website, these guys are stars of Australian radio. The Canadian BBC can't get enough of them. They said there was an NPR interview, but it's not on their website yet. So I'm going to go with this is amongst their American debuts.
It's true.
While we were waiting for this to start, the hubbub at the front of the room was so electric, it was very much like a beehive. And I think that's the perfect segue this evening to hear about Shakespeare's Beehive.
Good. Thank you.
My first concern was that Nika wasn't going to be involved in speaking, and now I'm glad that's, because as you can tell, this is a guy that steals the show.
Yes.
But the very first thing we ought to do is to thank Swann Galleries, because speaking of firsts, the New Yorker article came out on, it was Sunday evening, April 20th, that George and I rushed online to see what Adam Gopnik had written, and the next day it was on newsstands. And this is really the first opportunity that we have had to speak publicly in front of a group of people. And so we have Swann Galleries to thank for that, and thank you, George Lowry, for coming up with the idea. I hope, and part of me expects that over time, Swann will be recognized as being the first place to stick its neck out and have George Koppelman and Daniel Wechsler sit before them. We've done radio. We've been interviewed separately and together for stories, most of which have run on the web. But this is the first time that we've been in front of an audience. We'll be able to answer questions. And that's really going to be the basis of the evening, will be you asking us questions. But before we go there, we thought we would start by asking you a couple of questions. And the first one is, who in the audience read the New Yorker article? Very good. And now, different question. Who has read our book? This is a copy of it. Okay. So that really, in all seriousness, is our first problem. There's a difference in perception between reading an article in a magazine and having read the book. Most people have only read the New Yorker story, and I'm not so sure if we had read it, we would have given ourselves much of a chance, or the two guys who feel that they have, in the year 2008, bid on a book on eBay and then spent years with it thinking, wow, I wonder if it's Shakespeare's. I mean, it sounds so ridiculous, even to us to this day. It sounds crazy, and we will admit that. At the same time, we feel that the book, if you read it, does a decent job, at least, of raising the possibility beyond the plausible and making it into something that it seems that very well could be likely. And the second question has to do with the book itself. Who here has heard of Barrett's Alvieri before the New Yorker article came out? Anybody? Becky doesn't count. Becky lived with Barrett Salvieri on her dining room table, and there are a lot of crumbs on that table, I can attest to, for years, until about halfway in we put it into a secret storage. So only a couple of hands went up, and I bet of those hands, no one had thought of it in relation to Shakespeare before. What about Holinshed's Chronicles? Who heard of Holinshed's Chronicles? Interesting. And in relation to Shakespeare, most likely. That's where we hear about Holinshed. Well, one of the first things we can tell you about Barrett Salvieri are the extraordinary parallels to Holinshed. It was printed by a man named Henry Denham. Same with Holinshed. It was proofread and edited by a man by the name of Abraham Fleming. These are not household names, but the fact is Barrett Salvieri and Holinshed's Chronicles fit side by side perfectly. We know that Shakespeare used Holinshed. There are parts from Holinshed's text that go in almost word for word into the plays. Well, when was Holinshed's Chronicle published? It was published in 1587. But around 1584, Denham, having had so much trust in Fleming, asks him to be the editor of Holinshed's Chronicles. At some point after 1585, we know that Shakespeare made his way to London. He didn't make his way to London with a sack full of books. He came there with a lot of ideas, obviously. He had a very good education in Stratford, but he wouldn't have come with folio volumes. At some point soon after going into London, he must have immersed himself in the world of books. The people who made books was a part of their living. One of those people, Richard Field, also of Stratford, goes on to publish his first book and print the first two books with his name on it, that being Venus and Adonis and Rape of Lucrece. So this world of London and books, it's a pretty small one. And if we recognize how intimately Shakespeare knew his Holinshed, perhaps he made his way to the Barrett in the same way. Imagine being 4 or 5 years into this and reading that Shakespeare worked as a proofreader for Henry Denham. Even if that's someone's theory, coming out over roughly about 100 years ago, the fact is, there it was, right there, worked for Henry Denham. You turn to the last leaf of this book, and mind you, this is not the Dingus. This is a copy of Barrett Salvieri. A different copy. Actually belongs to a man named Robert Norris, who was one of the first to study Shakespearean language. So the question is, how did we get from acquiring a different copy of this book to presuming that it might be Shakespeare's? Not just presuming it, but feeling comfortable to make the argument. What was the evidence? So the evidence, of course, has to do with the annotations. And the annotations are about 3 different things, really. They're about the linguistics, the words themselves. What words are we seeing written into this book? The paleography, that is the study of handwriting, how they're being written in. And the third is, are there any personal effects? One of the personal effects that we noticed was an imitation in the letter W. Not every time, but a few times, the capital letter, the font that's printed in Barrett, the annotator has thought highly enough of it to, for whatever reason, make a little sort of awkward copy. Well, when we went through, after we had digitized it, looked at all the annotations, the only other letter that he does this with is the S. On and on it went like this, where every little bit of information seemed to suggest that it could be him. Certainly it was a guy that liked the W and S.
I remember the first time I saw one of the W's, I thought, oh, that's interesting. But, I didn't really, there's a cumulative sense we have of seeing all of the annotations that finally convinced us that it really can't be accidental or just a coincidence. And we, in addition to just the annotations, we actually started to feel we could understand. And what's really interesting about the annotations in the book is that a lot of times you open an old book and there are annotations, handwriting in the margins or marks, but they only go about 50 or 60 pages in, and then they stop. Everyone has seen books like this. But in our copy, they start from the A and they go all the way down to the Y. in roughly the same amount, the same number of annotations all the way through, interspersed.
With the same method. In other words, you can mark the text with symbols and also with words, underlining little circles, slashes. And most of the handwritten annotations come from the Barrett text.
Yeah.
But there's a very important selection of annotations that come from his mind, the biblical annotations, and others that we can discuss with you that aren't part of the Barrett, but part of his
Maybe I'll start the questions off. If anybody who doesn't know the story, you guys bought this on eBay. And you were almost going to stop bidding, but you decided very journalistically, dramatically to go an extra $2,500.
Well, we knew the bid we were going to place. We discussed it, and I came up. George spotted the book.
So I just want to backtrack a little bit. Were you looking for this dictionary in particular, a copy of this dictionary, thinking, if Shakespeare had a dictionary, this could be it?
No.
Or were you merely looking at an old book because you wanted to find an old what were you looking for?
Well, the annotations is what turned you on, right?
We saw this was an Elizabethan dictionary, meaning it was, printed during her 46 or 47-year reign. And the seller said there were annotations, and he showed about 18 or 20 of them, which looked contemporary and looked interesting. But as far as I knew nothing about dictionaries published during that period. And it just seemed to me, though, like such an interesting book with these annotations. And the few annotations that I started looking at, they seemed to be like little poetic fragments. And one I saw almost immediately was drought in summer. The three words, drought in summer. And it just seemed to me like that should be part of a poetic line. And indeed it is. It's part of a line in Titus Andronicus, which is that play of Shakespeare's that almost no one knows about. It's that gory, bloody Roman play that now is starting to be put on more.
Julie Taymor loves it. She did a big production.
So there is a line.
In summer's drought.
In summer's drought, attend upon thee still, or something. The rain, attend upon me still, and so that was like the first inkling I had that, these were indeed poetic fragments. There were a lot of poets at that time, of course, but it made these annotations more interesting.
It was clear the annotated aspect of the book was the reason why George contacted me. And then in discussing what number we should bid, we went back and forth trying to come up with a number that made sense. And I said, let's try $4,300. So the auction closed at $4,050.
So if any of us were looking for Bacon's dictionary, what do Elizabethan dictionaries run in general? Unannotated dictionaries.
Well, the first thing I was going to ask Toby was, could this book ever have come up at Swann? Maybe Swann Galleries auctioned it off at some point. He might know. Early printed books actually aren't that easy to sell always. Toby's sales are about 95% sold, so he won't hear anything like that. But they go for a range of prices. I've purchased 3 of them since then for between. Only one of them was a little cheaper than the one we got on eBay. But Bacon, unlike Shakespeare, there are examples of his marginal hand. So if it was Bacon's dictionary, we could have gone in that direction.
So I think what we should do now is open the floor up to anybody else who has a question.
Yes.
Did you have any concern about the bona fides of the seller? What did you know? I don't remember if this was in the New York article. Did you know anything about the seller?
We know about him now a bit.
No.
But we had followed his auctions enough to know that he sold books professionally for a living. He had his own website. George, you had bid on some books of his before, correct?
I think I had bought 1 or 2 of his books before. And in eBay, there's a lot of the popular thinking that, well, you have to be very careful what you buy on eBay. But actually, they do have this feedback system where if someone is really being a scoundrel, they invite feedback to that extent. And in fact, they will no longer let such a person bid. But this person has been buying books and putting them on eBay. That's his business. He doesn't have a shop like Dan. He doesn't issue, catalogs every year like I do. His business, he gets a book, he writes it up well, not as well as, he didn't write it up very well 6 years ago. And he starts his book off at $1. Every book starts at $1. And that's it. If that's the bid he gets, he's going to sell the book for $1. But he's smart enough that he knows he has a very good inkling now of what a book should get him.
I think you didn't, forgive me, I'm not sure that either of you actually answered Nicholas's question, which is, what were you looking for? I mean,
We had both developed an interest in books where there was a relationship between the owner and the book. So you're not going to get that if a book is not annotated. So really it was about annotated books. Those were the books that began to become more appealing. Otherwise, it's just a copy of a book. Here's a copy of the same book that is owned by a famous Shakespearean. There's not a single note in it by him. There are a few scribbles by a fellow John White. He's written John White, his book. But there's nothing really to go on here as far as putting together a story between the owner and the text itself. Through that communication between annotator and text, you learn a lot. And from a business perspective, I think we can say this, the book is much more interesting. You can describe it in a way that will hopefully attract more people to possibly buy it. When books are not annotated, they lose something. So that it's really the annotations that drew us to this particular copy.
Stuart?
I was just a quick follow-up.
Yes.
Having determined the bona fides of the seller, have you spoken to him since?
No, we hope to have him in our movie. A documentary has started, and really the documentary is not complete until he's interviewed. So at some point we will contact him. So this copy of Barrett probably sold in a smaller auction house, possibly even as a group lot.
Yeah.
The other dictionary of the period is Thomas Cooper's dictionary, Thomas Cooper's Thesaurus. I bought a copy for 250 pounds just a few months ago. So that's an example of a dictionary. Actually, that one was printed a little bit earlier, the particular copy that I bought, and then it went for next to nothing. Yeah. So these books are not in such great demand in terms of the public eye. It's not like a Holinshed.
Right.
Could you tell us a little something? Could you tell us a little something about the handwriting? Because there are at least two different shapes to it.
Right. Well, the two primary handwritings of the period are the italic and the secretarial hand. The secretarial hand was the hand that was more common in England in the first half of the 16th century, and even going up toward the end of the 16th century, particularly someone of Shakespeare's background. But it was very common with people of the period to write in two types of hands, two principal types, italic and secretarial. Once the italic comes in, the end of the century, the beginning of the next century, it takes over and is really the hand of the period. And we noticed some very interesting things about it when we looked at one particular dictionary of Shakespeare. One line in Gopnik's article that did sort of grab us as perhaps something that was a little bothersome when he said it's not the poet's hand. Yes. He didn't attribute that to anybody, and I think it's very important for everyone to understand there are no accepted copies of books from Shakespeare's library with his handwriting in it, so we don't really know what it would look like. But there's one signature in particular. Why don't you tell a little bit about signature C?
Well, there are 6 acknowledged signatures of Shakespeare. They're all on legal documents, including 3 on his last will, which had 3 pages. He had to sign each page. They're all from the last 2 years of his life, basically after he had stopped writing plays. One is called Signature C, and this was found late in his life. He came to London and he bought a nice piece of property, the Blackfriars Gatehouse. He probably bought it as speculation, as a speculative investment. He signed the mortgage and he signed the deed. And Signature C is where he signed the mortgage. But he didn't sign a piece of vellum. He signed a seal that was attached to the mortgage. It's about this big. It's roughly 1.25 inches by 3/4 inch. That was the space he had to sign his name. He couldn't scroll it across a sheet of paper. And of those 6 signatures, this is the one that really is he uses separated letters.
Disconnected letters.
Disconnected letters. And we were able to find many examples in our book in which he was writing a marginal annotation or an annotation not necessarily in the margin.
In a similarly sized space.
Yes, in exactly a space that's within the same size, roughly within 3 or 4% of that size. And we have 3 or 4 examples of many letters in that signature where he has corresponding letters in a word he's adding to our dictionary that look almost exactly the same, or the characteristics of the letters, these disconnected letters, are very much the same. And that, of the 6 signatures, we really, and given this size, the similar size, and it's interesting, in that mortgage document, and that mortgage document is now in the British Library, I believe, yes. And
there are 2 other signatures, one of which goes right over the seal.
Yeah.
And the other one, it kind of stays within the confines of the seal.
Also goes over.
Barely.
Yeah.
I mean, it's more or less on there. But
someone else who signed this mortgage document not only didn't restrict himself to the seal, but went way over to the edge and onto the vellum. And we also noticed that of our annotator, many times he comes to each column of text has a vertical line. Oh yes, just open to any page.
Yeah, you can see what it would take to write in between these lines. I think even from where you're seated, you can tell how cramped it would be to squeeze words between these lines. Well, often when he's up against a line, he will either abbreviate the annotation or make every effort to squeeze it in there. Now, there are times when he goes over. It's not systematically, but he does his best not to go over the lines most of the time.
He doesn't like to go over the line. Yes, he's.
So let's Adam in the back. Yeah.
Hi.
Hey, Adam.
So let's take for granted there's a very clear association between the annotations in the book and some of Shakespeare's writings, which obviously form the basis for your premise. So I have a question. When do you think Shakespeare owned this book? When do you think he made the annotations? Because, for instance, do some of the annotations reference something early in his career, for instance, like Richard III? Do some reference later in his career, like Henry VIII, which would give you an indication of perhaps when he owned it or when he would annotate it? Because you need that, I feel like, to surmount some of the skepticism.
Of course.
Which is, did somebody annotate the book who was just familiar later on with Shakespeare's first folio and knew all of the plays?
Well, there's several questions in there, really, and we'll try to address several of them. Behind us here is the one leaf in the book that has the most amount of writing in it. We refer to it in our book as the trailing blank. And you can see, well, you can't see from there, but there is a hunter's horn watermark here, which he even makes reference to that we didn't realize at first. But we feel that
it's not in the book.
This page of writing is almost certainly written around 1597, 1598. The allusions are all to Merry Wives of Windsor, the 2 parts of Henry IV, and whoever he's giving himself a French lesson of sorts. And Henry V is written 1598, 1599. So we even see parallels there. This is the annotator at the end of the process. We feel that Shakespeare probably got the book sometime, obviously, after he's in London now, and through the connections with Richard Field, Henry Denham. Did he actually work as a proofreader for Henry Denham? We see awful lots of signs of proofreading, and at first that threw us. We thought to ourselves, would Shakespeare have worked as a proofreader? Once he's established in the theater, it doesn't make any sense for him to, at that point, go out and work for someone who sells books or acquire books. We like to think of Shakespeare as some genius running around, coming up with these wonderful words, but in reality, he's much more reliant on books than people realize. Scholars make these points, but a lot of people don't read the books showing out the parallels with the Ovid, with Holinshed, with Plutarch. By today's standards, it would be plagiarism. Shakespeare must have had a library. There were certain books that we know that he used. This one seems to fit right there in there with them. Now, the second part of your question, how this wouldn't be a Shakespeare reader at some point later. Yeah, George, why don't you address that?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I say research probably over the last 30 years, scholarly research has looked at remnants of people's of libraries of people who lived in that period. And there are a number of libraries, the ones we know about were donated to universities at Oxford and Cambridge, or some wound up and are now in the British Library. There are actually people, for example, there's one named, I love this name, Scrippen Spire. Scrippen Squire, Squyer. He was a collector, he was a lawyer, and he had a number of books of some of Shakespeare's quartos that were in his collection. Here's Pericles, Prince of Tyre, one of Shakespeare's least known plays today, but one of his most successful plays in his period.
Written right at the end of his career.
Yes, and he makes some corrections in the text of this quarto. He's really just correcting misspellings. And the next one in this book is somebody named Humphrey Dyson, who actually is credited with having made the first correction, the first allusion to one of Shakespeare's plays, to having seen one of Shakespeare's plays in one of Shakespeare's books. But again, Humphrey.
And what year is that? Is that dated?
Yeah, these are roughly at the
Dyson
time.
one.
The Dyson one, shortly after the
I highlight
play
that
came out.
because books of the period with allusions to Shakespeare are incredibly rare. There's almost none of them.
Yeah.
And if someone were to use a book like this to draw allusion to Shakespeare's work, you wouldn't have thousands and thousands of annotations without a single line from a play, without a single character name. It would be almost impossible to annotate a book like this.
Yeah.
There's further evidence in the form of the biblical annotations, all of which the annotator is recalling from memory and correspond, when there's a difference in the word, to the earlier Bibles. In other words, if they had corresponded to the King James Bible, which came out in 1611, you could say, okay, it's a later annotator. But whoever the annotator was, he's recalling these earlier Bibles, the Bishop's Bible and the Great Bible. And that's an extraordinary piece of evidence. We drop that in throughout, but we deal with it right at the beginning of our book, just how important that is and how unlikely it would be that someone was making these notes after the first folio, just based on the biblical annotations.
Scholarly reaction you're getting?
Well, we haven't really gotten one yet from the true scholar. We've had graduate students weigh in, but weigh in rather unthoroughly. We took turns communicating with scholars. I wrote to Stephen Greenblatt, to Stanley Wells, the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, Stanley Wells and Paul Edmondson. They'll be coming to New York in August. They want to take a look at the book. They were very enthusiastic in recent emails with me, but that's kept more or less private. They know what's at stake here, and so their enthusiasm has to be a little bit contained, similar to the Folger. George communicated with Margareta de Grazia recently. Why don't you tell them a little bit about that?
We had spoken to her earlier, and she gave us some very, very great encouragement a couple of years before we had this book ready. She said, we'd made an astounding discovery. And what she gave us was that the annotations in our dictionary showed how quickly she felt, how quickly Shakespeare's language got into the
Well,
the spoken language.
She was given it as a possibility, she said,
right,
at the time.
But which was, she said, and we know now that we've at least established that that the language in Barrett really was used by Shakespeare, definitely. They're unmistakable.
But she tried to. She told you she tried to contact the TLS herself. She was so in love with the book. Jerry Kelly, who was here tonight, who designed this incredibly beautiful book. Jerry has done many beautiful books, and we are just so grateful that he joined us on this one. Thank you, Jerry. And
I'm going to ask. You mentioned that all of the Shakespeare scholars who you've contacted know what's at stake.
Yes.
Spell out for us in two different ways. What's at stake historically, and let's be as crass as we can possibly be.
Sure.
What's this book worth?
Well, I'll give you one word answer to that. Priceless. If you could prove that a book was acquired by Shakespeare when he made his way to London, before he had entered the London theater world, worked for someone, acquired a copy of a dictionary and annotated it and kept it on his desk for his entire life, thoroughly annotated, and then 400 years pass and two guys buy it on eBay, you've got a priceless book.
But that won't pay the rent.
Well, the word priceless itself won't. Now, people have accused us of greed, whatnot.
Well, that's been something of a problem for us, because in addition to
Ties
being
into the other thing.
yeah, I mean, in addition, I mean, we do have some financial investment, but Dan and I have a real intellectual investment in this book, and in what we've perceived about the annotations, and that's what we've written about. So it's very, but in terms of, say, a scholar coming out, or the first scholar coming out with an opinion, he knows that it's going to affect the possible value of this book. And
we knew
that's
that was
a
a problem
difficulty.
from the very first day.
I mean, we've been in much better, we would in a way be in much easier shape than if we had gotten, Thomas Nash's dictionary or George Chapman's dictionary.
Probably the fastest way to get scholars behind this is to say that we're donating it to the Folger tomorrow. We're just giving it to them.
But we ain't.
No, but what would be interesting is to see if that would accelerate the process, because it really is a problem, and it's a problem in other collectible fields as well, because if you authenticate something, or if you are an expert and you lend belief to something, you are then tied to the process by which that artifact is sold. And so we knew that was going to be a problem all along.
There are also legal problems involved in that sort of thing. But in effect, though, we mentioned the Folger. I mean, we would like to see this wind up at a library that was, open to scholars, and the Folger and the British Library, don't only have Shakespeare material. They have all the surrounding material from that period, the other playwrights, the other critics, the other poets. And Dan and I went down to the Folger a couple of years ago one day. We wanted to look up a particular author. And they brought us out these 7 or 8 books. It was fantastic. I mean, we'd love to see this wind up. We want this book. We feel, we've found a lot out about this book, but there's a lot more in there that we have not had a chance to really bring out for ourselves or for the scholarly community. So we don't want this just to go to some,
If it has to be an auction house, let it be Swann. Yes, Christine.
On that same tag, I was wondering, and I know the two of you, I've known you for years, and you love books and research and writing, but did it ever start to, once you kind of knew what you had, did it feel like a burden?
Oh,
did
yes.
you feel like you want to give this up, turn it over to scholars?
Yes.
Oh, yes,
Talk
definitely.
about, because that's an interesting
We shared
part
the
of that
burden
journey.
over many, many lunches, because we didn't share it with anyone in the trade. We knew that as soon as you bring it up to a colleague, that's the subject, and you're on that subject from that point forward. And that was a very exhausting thing, to have to hold the secret in of doing the research. I felt a lot better, I don't know if you have, since the story came out, no matter what people think, even when someone says something nasty, I was like, oh, whatever.
Well, that really gave us the urge to get this book done by a certain time. Since this book has been printed, we've probably made 4 or 5 other significant discoveries in the annotations. This afternoon even. But at some point, it has to be published. It has to be put out there for other people to look at and weigh in on. And having this book out and having the New Yorker article out it was a great relief to us.
Big relief to
It
both
really
of us.
was.
If we could do one thing differently, we would have started writing the book a lot sooner. Really, we wrote the book in about 8 months.
Yeah.
When you look at the time of our emails, and we were trying to accumulate evidence to persuade scholars, and we were making the fact that we were writing to some of the biggest scholars in the world who didn't know who we were, and we were getting very nice responses from almost all of them, indicated to us that they were intrigued.
Yeah.
But we kept sort of showing them this example, that example, over and over again. I think, if we had sort of played our cards a little differently in hindsight, it would have been to start on the book sooner. I think we could have gotten even more in there. And I think what people need to realize is that this book can be improved upon. It's one thing to disagree with our ultimate conclusion, but there's really more than is even in here.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Yeah, so I'm going to follow up with that as far as the public reception of what has happened since, I guess we all know that you're very popular in Australia, according to the introductory comments. So there's no quarrel down under, apparently.
Right. Did you hear from some people who didn't you hadn't heard from in a long time?
Oh yes.
I think we both did. So I mean, from a personal perspective.
I was just kidding, and I'm saying he was as well.
But as far as the general public goes, we've had everything from people write to us, say they read the book, and they're very convinced. We've had other people, of course, who've tweeted things.
I was going to ask you if you could
things.
make a simplified USA Today pie chart of opprobrium to skepticism.
Right.
Like what sort of colors would it look like, and what categories?
Right.
How that would appear.
We attracted some skeptics immediately.
Instantaneously.
Yes.
My favorite tweet was the one that said, I've just taken a look at their website. The annotations have nothing to do with Shakespeare. We can all rest very easily tonight.
Yeah.
And that was that. And in 10 seconds, they tried to, and so we kept reminding ourselves that if you had a book where Shakespeare was evident on any of the pages, just like that, there was no way that book would survive, since he dies in 1616. So you're talking almost 400 years without anybody noticing. It would have to be a book under the radar. This book, when it arrived, the covers were off. It was a mess. Right. It was the type of book that you wouldn't look This copy
is gorgeous.
Had it gone to an auction with the other one, a week after we bought it, this one would have sold for more money. And that's just because the binding is contemporary. This other one has been rebound at a later date. And it just doesn't purport to be anything. So we don't have to worry that someone's going to say that someone is trying to make this book look like Shakespeare's dictionary. As George said to me at one point, almost only the most incompetent forger in history would put forth this group of annotations to try to suggest that it was Shakespeare's dictionary.
Yes.
Not to bring up William Henry Ireland, but I am.
Sure.
Knowing him better than most people in this room.
Adam Gopnik brought him up.
Yes.
Provenance, provenance, provenance. Until that issue is laid to rest and your dealer, the guy you bought it from,
Right.
fesses up, I think it's still going to be the elephant in the room.
Well, I think it's only the elephant in the room, though, after people think that the annotations add up to being Shakespeare. Because until it does, why is the Ireland in the picture? I don't know how you...
Yeah, I mean, Ireland was a peculiar and strange case, and he was basically taken down shortly after he became. I mean, this was a 17-year-old boy who, to impress his father, pretended he discovered all these Shakespeare letters, and at one point he even wrote a Shakespeare play. He said, "Oh, look what I found, the play of Shakespeare." And it even went to one performance. But knowledgeable critics quickly took him down. His ideas about the language were wrong. Everything.
But our book has nothing like that.
Nothing. I mean, our book has there's no real attempt in our book of anyone who's attempting to pretend, or you don't see any. I mean, this was a word book. This was Shakespeare's source of words, synonyms, and
proverbial phrases, other things. But to answer your question a little more thoroughly about provenance, when Stanley Wells was on the phone with me, he asked where we had gotten it. And when I said eBay, he kind of gasped. And I said, but Stanley, you can buy books from the second half of the 16th century. Pick a year. On eBay tonight, there's probably one closing. My office has enormous numbers of books from the 16th, the 17th centuries, up and down the shelves. The first thing I would tell you about them is they're not that easy to sell. And I can't tell you in any of the cases who owned them in the year 1740, some of these books. Shakespeare's, his heirs die out. We're talking about the end of the 17th century. There's no direct descendant.
No.
And so there are going to be gaps with this book no matter what. I don't think we'll ever know where it was in, we know where a 19th century owner.
Yes.
That's the closest we got, but we're not, that still lives a tremendous gap in
Yeah.
provenance.
And I don't think there'll be any way of filling that gap. Yeah, yes.
What's to say that if Shakespeare died in 1616, you
Yes.
said, what's to say that this book wasn't annotated in 1672 by somebody else who was looking at Shakespeare's plays and said, hey, look.
Well, for one, we don't think they would be remembering the Bishop's Bible, which was totally phased out by then, or the Great Bible even earlier. So those biblical annotations really eliminate an annotator from 1672 because they wouldn't, the annotations that we have in the margins, they're not from a printed book. They're from memory. You can tell that by the spelling and the word choice. The word order, and so there's archaic language in addition to that, but really the biblical annotations more than anything else rule out 1672, and in 1672, that was actually a period where Shakespeare wasn't that popular, but let's pick a year 1740 where there is already popularity, it's swelled back, you just couldn't come up with annotations in the thousands thinking about Shakespeare and not have any direct allusion to a play in an actual word.
There's no name of a play, no name of a character, except some of the very minor characters, which are
we
derived
think we know
very
where the
interesting.
names have come from.
And the name of the dog in one of his early plays, The Gentleman of Verona.
Two Gentlemen of Verona, yeah.
Two Gentlemen of Verona. The dog's name is Crab, and you don't even know this yet, Dan, but I just saw something on the net that's the only dog in Shakespeare's plays. Isn't that amazing?
With a name.
With a name,
Because
yes.
he says one of the things, so we would start going to Shakespeare's performances and hearing lines that were changed. I saw a performance of the first part of Henry IV, and he says, I'd sooner hear my lady hound sing in Irish. And I said, it's Brock. We have that in 3 different, or break, I think it's pronounced. That's like it's like a hound, but they realize for audiences today, they're not going to know that word. The only time that Shakespeare refers to a dog by name
Yes.
is in Two Gentlemen. He didn't like dogs, apparently. Probably only about 1,000.
And that's probably a high number.
750 to 1,000. It was an active printing house. I think that somewhere in there is probably the correct answer. Yeah. It's close enough to suggest that there's magic alone in any of the copies having been belonging to Shakespeare. We know a little bit more about Holinshed production through records in the stationer's office, but every time I see and hold a Holinshed, it's impossible for it not to go through my head, hey, maybe. He used one of them so carefully. One of the real advantages, I think, of this book is that it's the exact same team of people that are putting the book together. I think that's a real kind of piece of evidence that has fallen to our favor in rather recently, actually.
All right, are there any other questions? I think what we're going to do now is thank you guys very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I just want to go on record. I think it's real.
Thank you, Nick.
I really, really want it to be. I want it to be real, very, very badly.
We want it to be real too.
Yes.
And I think if you read the book, you'll think that there's at least a chance that it's real. And if you don't, write to us. Tell us why.
Speaking of the book is for sale at the back of the room. I think Dan and George will be signing copies this evening. We welcome you all to stay, to have a book signed, have another drink, have a little curry sandwich. They're very nice. And thank you to Dan and George, really, for coming in, for all of your work, and good luck.
Thank you. We'll need it.